Some people drift away because they lose interest. Others disappear because they never truly cared. But when an INTP withdraws, it's almost never that simple. They don't leave because they're bored. They don't grow distant because they've stopped loving. They pull away because something inside them, something tender, quiet, and deeply misunderstood begins to ache. At their core, INTPs are thinkers. They're analysts, observers, internal explorers of meaning and logic. But underneath all of that cognition is a surprisingly delicate heart, one that opens slowly but deeply, a heart that rarely trusts, and when it does, trusts completely. So when they begin to retreat from someone they care about, it isn't a decision made in haste. It's a slow unraveling, often unnoticed by the person on the other side. Because the truth is, INTPs long for connection. Not the superficial kind, but something real, something built on mutual respect for each other's inner worlds. They may not say it, they may not show it with grand gestures, but they crave a bond that feels spacious and safe, where they don't have to perform, where curiosity and individuality are not just tolerated but welcomed. And when that kind of connection begins to feel impossible, that's when they begin to fade. Their withdrawal is rarely triggered by just one event. It's often the slow accumulation of unspoken disappointments, misunderstandings, the quiet realization that they are not truly being seen. And because INTPs process most of their emotions inwardly, they rarely express these feelings in the moment. They absorb them, rationalize them, try to understand them. And only when it becomes too heavy to carry do they quietly step back. Sometimes people around them don't even notice the shift at first. INTPs are already private by nature, but internally the landscape begins to change. Where there was once warmth and curiosity, there's now a cautious distance, a watching, a reevaluation, and not out of resentment, but out of necessity, because INTPs don't like conflict. They don't want to hurt anyone. They would rather shoulder their pain silently than risk saying something that could make the situation worse. And so they disengage gently, respectfully, often with grace that goes unrecognized. And while the other person may interpret this as indifference, in reality it's often the opposite. They are withdrawing not out of anger, but out of grief. A grief that says, I thought we could meet each other in truth, but I'm starting to feel invisible. A grief that wonders, if I have to keep explaining why I need space, will you ever truly accept me? It erodes. Bit by bit, it wears away at their hope until distance feels safer than closeness. INTPs are also incredibly sensitive to expectations, especially unspoken ones. When they feel pressure to constantly engage, to always be more present, to explain themselves in emotional terms that don't come naturally, they begin to feel like they are slowly being erased, like they have to trade authenticity for harmony. And while they may comply for a while, their mind never stops measuring the cost. And when that cost becomes too great, their retreat begins not as punishment, but as preservation. This withdrawal is not coldness. It is self-protection. It is the mind trying to stay intact when the heart feels unseen. They still care. They still think about the conversations shared. They still remember the moments of closeness. But now, those memories carry weight, and their once open door begins to close, not with a slam, but with a slow and silent latch. One of the first, and most common, reasons an INTP begins to pull away is mental exhaustion from emotional overexposure. While they may seem detached or unbothered on the outside, inside, their emotional processing is deep, layered, and often slow. INTPs don't rush to feelings. They arrive at them after thinking, reflecting, decoding. But when they are in a relationship that constantly demands immediate emotional availability, they start to feel overwhelmed. Not because they don't care, but because the pace of emotional expectation doesn't match the rhythm of their internal world. They need space not to create distance, but to create clarity. For an INTP, silence isn't a sign of disconnection, it's a processing chamber. It's where they untangle their thoughts, recalibrate their emotions, and find the meaning beneath the surface. But when that space is interpreted as coldness, or worse, rejection, it creates a painful contradiction. To stay present is to drown, but to pull back is to be misunderstood. Eventually, they choose to pull back, not to punish, but to breathe. Another reason they withdraw is the invisible burden of unmet intellectual connection. While emotional intimacy matters to them, what truly feeds their spirit is mental intimacy. They crave conversations that stretch beyond daily logistics or surface level affirmations. They want to explore ideas, question systems, share theories, challenge perspectives. For INTPs, this isn't optional, it's nourishment. But when they find themselves in a relationship where ideas are shut down, curiosity is discouraged, or exploration is seen as impractical or annoying, they begin to wither in silence. They might try to adjust, to dim their mental light, to just talk about normal things. But over time, they feel like they're speaking a language no one around them understands. And while they may not demand to be understood, they ache to be met intellectually. When that need is neglected, it leaves them feeling isolated even in the closest relationships. And so, they turn inward, not out of superiority, but out of sorrow. Because being unseen in your most cherished language is one of the loneliest feelings there is. INTPs also begin to withdraw when they sense a lack of autonomy or mutual respect for boundaries. They are not possessive, and they do not try to control others, but they are fiercely protective of their own freedom, freedom to think, to drift, to be quiet, to not explain everything, to be immersed in their own mental universe without constant interruption. In relationships where their independence is questioned or interpreted as emotional distance, they start to feel suffocated. They don't want to be fixed. They want to be trusted. And when someone repeatedly intrudes on that space with accusations, demands, or guilt, the INTP doesn't fight. They retreat. Not because they don't care, but because explaining their need for freedom over and over again feels like slowly bleeding identity. So they distance themselves to preserve it. A quieter, more subtle reason they withdraw is the fatigue of masking. Most INTPs learn early on that their way of being analytical, slow to emote, nonlinear can be hard for others to understand. So they adapt. They smile when they're tired. They nod when they're confused. They give answers when they haven't finished thinking. And they do it not out of deception, but out of love. But masking, no matter how kind the intention, is emotionally expensive. And if they find themselves constantly performing in a relationship, constantly softening their edges to be more palatable, it doesn't take long before they begin to shut down, not with a grand exit, not with a confrontation, but with a quiet retreat into the one place they've always felt safe, their own mind. To outsiders, this might look like apathy. To the INTP, it feels like survival. At the center of the INTP psyche is a profound need to process privately. Their world is built on reflection, internal logic, and slow understanding. So when conflict arises, especially emotional conflict, they don't rush toward confrontation. They don't immediately open up or talk it out in real time. Instead, they retreat inward to make sense of it, not to avoid resolution, but to reach one that feels true. The challenge is that most people expect conflict to be addressed emotionally, immediately, and verbally, but for INTPs, these expectations often feel overwhelming, like trying to untangle a knot while someone's asking you to explain the knot at the same time. It's not that they don't care about resolution. It's that their clarity comes after the storm, not during it. When given the space to think through their emotions, INTPs can return with remarkable insight, accountability, and growth. But when they're pressured to respond before they're ready, when every pause is taken as avoidance, every silence is guilt, they begin to shut down. And the relationship, instead of becoming a place of safety, becomes a source of emotional urgency. That urgency slowly corrodes the INTP's ability to stay open. They also withdraw when emotional logic is consistently dismissed. INTPs experience emotions, but they filter them through analysis. When they're hurt, they try to understand why. When they're frustrated, they examine the system that led there. But in emotionally reactive environments, their way of processing can be seen as cold or disconnected. Phrases like, "stop thinking so much," or "you're being too logical," can land like sharp, invisible cuts. Over time, those messages teach them that their natural way of navigating pain isn't welcome, and instead of fighting to be understood, they quietly begin to withdraw, not out of superiority, but out of exhaustion. Because being told, again and again, that the way you make sense of life is wrong begins to erode the very framework of trust. Another painful trigger is the experience of being emotionally punished for honesty. INTPs are naturally honest, sometimes to a fault. They don't sugarcoat and they don't play emotional games. When they speak, they usually mean it. But when that honesty is met with hostility, defensiveness, or guilt tripping, it reinforces a dangerous idea: truth costs too much. And so, to preserve peace, they begin to say less, share less, feel less safe being real. Eventually, that silence becomes a wall, and behind that wall, the INTP still cares, still reflects, still questions, but the door begins to close. They may still listen, still offer help, still show up in ways that seem fine. But inside, they are already halfway out the door, not because they stopped loving, but because they feel like there is no safe space left to be themselves. One of the most heartbreaking reasons they pull away is because of emotional inconsistency. INTPs don't need constant affection, but they do crave stability, predictability, emotional integrity. When someone says one thing but does another, or shifts between affection and distance without explanation, it throws the INTP into deep internal dissonance. They start replaying interactions, analyzing every tone, every sentence, every shift in mood, not because they're paranoid, but because they need coherence. Without it, they can't trust the foundation of the relationship. And when trust starts to crack, withdrawal becomes inevitable. But even then, their leaving is never loud. There are no grand declarations, no storming out, no drama, just distance, quietly created, gently maintained. Because for the INTP, withdrawal isn't about escape. It's about trying to preserve their truth in an environment where their truth no longer feels welcome. Behind the INTP's composed exterior and quiet logic is a deep emotional vulnerability, one they rarely show, even to the people they care about most. It's not that they lack emotion. It's that their emotions are intensely private, almost sacred. To expose them feels risky, like opening a door to a room they've spent years building to feel safe. So when they do open that door, when they share a raw truth, a strange theory, a personal wound, they're not doing it casually. They're taking a real risk. They're saying, in their own quiet way, I trust you, and if that offering is misunderstood, ridiculed, or ignored, the internal damage is far greater than anyone around them might realize. It's not just embarrassment, it's exposure without refuge, and that pain doesn't explode outward, it folds inward, silently, deeply. When this happens, INTPs rarely argue. They don't fight to be heard. Instead, they retreat, and the wound becomes part of their mental log evidence that emotional openness leads to misalignment. It's not stubbornness. It's protection, because if vulnerability keeps being met with emotional volatility, judgment, or confusion, they will slowly begin to close that door again. Not out of resentment, but because the cost of being misunderstood starts to outweigh the joy of being seen. Another hidden reason they withdraw is because of inner self-doubt, something many INTPs carry quietly. From the outside, they may seem confident in their ideas and thoughts, but internally they are constantly questioning, analyzing, replaying. When a relationship starts highlighting their perceived inadequacies, whether subtly or overtly, it triggers a storm of internal doubt. They start wondering, am I too much? Too quiet? Too complicated? Too detached? And rather than express these doubts, they try to solve them internally, alone. But when they can't reach clarity, when the relationship keeps stirring confusion instead of calming it, they begin to feel defective, broken, out of sync, and instead of asking for reassurance which doesn't come naturally to them, they quietly begin to disappear. Sometimes this withdrawal is about avoiding emotional dependence. INTPs are fiercely independent, and the idea of relying too heavily on another person emotionally, mentally, or existentially can feel unsettling. They're not afraid of closeness, but they are afraid of losing themselves in someone else's emotional orbit. When a relationship starts to feel all-consuming, or when their individuality feels at risk, they instinctively create space. They're not running from love. They're not afraid of connection. They're trying to protect their center, the internal compass that keeps them grounded. This is especially true in relationships where emotional needs are not clearly communicated, but rather implied or expected. INTPs don't pick up on subtle emotional cues the way feelers often do, and when they're held responsible for feelings that were never spoken, they feel unfairly burdened. They don't mind showing care, they just want to understand how and why it's needed. Without that clarity, they start feeling like they're failing at something they were never taught how to do. And slowly, that sense of failure turns into distance. Yet the most haunting reason of all might be this. They still care, but they no longer feel safe to show it. They think about the relationship often. They replay conversations, remember moments of laughter, of peace. They wonder if it could have gone differently, but they stay quiet. Not because they don't feel, but because they've accepted that staying might mean slowly eroding their sense of self. So they choose silence over sacrifice, solitude over distortion, truth over comfort, and the withdrawal, while painful, becomes a quiet act of self-respect. When an INTP withdraws, it's not a sign that they never cared. It's often the clearest evidence that they cared too much and didn't know how to survive it. They carry the weight of unspoken thoughts and quiet disappointments. They try, in their own reserved way, to make things work. They adapt, they listen, they analyze and reflect. But when the relationship begins to cost them their clarity, their inner stillness, or their sense of truth, they start to disappear, not with bitterness, but with quiet resignation. They are not closing the door to punish you. They are closing it because leaving it open was letting the storm in. INTPs value harmony, but not the kind that comes from pretending. They want peace, not performance. And when they sense that a relationship is requiring them to become someone, they're not more emotionally reactive, more expressive, more typical. They may comply for a while, but inside something begins to fracture. It's not a conscious rebellion. It's an unconscious recalibration, a slow return to the solitude where they can hear themselves again. It's important to understand that withdrawal, for the INTP, is rarely about giving up on the other person. It's often about giving up on the hope that the relationship will make room for who they actually are. Because at their core, INTPs want to be loved as they are, not for their potential, not for how well they perform emotional scripts, but for the unique way they love, quietly, consistently, and with depth that few people ever see. They may not text you constantly. They may not say the perfect words in the perfect tone. They may need time, space, and silence. But when they choose to be present, they are fully present. When they open their mind to you, they are offering you a kingdom of thoughts, carefully structured, endlessly complex. And when they let you into their inner world, the one they usually reserve for systems, ideas, and possibilities, they are letting you into something sacred. So if you felt an INTP pull away, pause before assuming it was indifference. Ask yourself, did they feel safe to speak honestly without being punished for their tone? Did they feel intellectually met, not just emotionally needed? Did they have space to recharge, to think, to be? Did they feel appreciated not just for what they gave, but for who they are? If not, it's no wonder they began to withdraw. Not because they stopped loving, but because they stopped feeling like they were allowed to be real. And if you are an INTP yourself, know this, you're not too distant. You're not too slow to speak. You're not too logical. You're simply wired differently and beautifully. Your withdrawal isn't a flaw. It's a message. It's your mind's way of telling you that something no longer feels aligned. And while it's okay to take space, it's also okay to ask for connection that feels real to you. Because you deserve relationships where you don't have to translate yourself constantly, where your way of processing is not only understood but respected, where your quiet kind of love is seen for what it truly is, deep, patient, and profoundly intentional.